The remarkable story I'm about to tell you began on a sweltering summer Tuesday afternoon in July, precisely at 2:45, when the sun was blazing mercilessly down on the city, creating shimmering heat waves that rose from the asphalt and made even short walks feel exhausting and oppressive when Ricardo Mendez collapsed suddenly and without warning in the executive conference room of his own company during what had been an intense and contentious board meeting about quarterly profits and strategic expansion plans that Ricardo had been defending aggressively against shareholders who questioned his increasingly risky and ethically questionable business decisions. Ricardo was 51 years old, a self-made billionaire who had built a massive pharmaceutical and medical supply empire from a single small drugstore he had purchased 30 years earlier with borrowed money and sheer determination, growing it through aggressive acquisition strategies, brilliant marketing, strategic political connections, and a ruthless willingness to prioritize profit over absolutely everything else, including employee welfare, product safety concerns, and ethical considerations about pricing life-saving medications at levels that bankrupted desperate sick people who had no choice but to pay whatever was demanded. The collapse was sudden and terrifying to everyone present, with Ricardo standing at the head of the conference table gesticulating angrily while making a point about market share and competitive positioning when suddenly his face went pale, his words became slurred and incomprehensible, his right arm went completely limp, hanging uselessly at his side, and he crumpled to the expensive carpet while other executives scrambled back from the table in shock and confusion about what was happening. Someone had the presence of mind to call emergency services immediately, while others stood frozen and useless, not knowing what to do or how to help. And within minutes, paramedics arrived with equipment and efficiency to stabilize Ricardo and transport him urgently to the nearest major hospital, which happened to be the very same hospital that his company supplied with medical equipment and medications through contracts that had been negotiated to maximize his company's profits while providing the hospital with barely adequate products at inflated prices. Ricardo was rushed directly to the emergency department and then transferred quickly to the intensive care unit when initial assessments indicated he had suffered a major ischemic stroke caused by a blood clot blocking blood flow to a significant portion of his brain, a medical emergency that required immediate intervention to minimize permanent damage and potentially save his life. The ICU, where Ricardo found himself fighting for survival, was staffed by a team of doctors and nurses who worked with remarkable coordination and expertise, despite being chronically understaffed and undersupported due to hospital budget constraints that were partly the result of having to overpay for medications and supplies from companies like Ricardo's that had monopolized markets and eliminated competition through aggressive business practices. Among the nursing staff assigned to Ricardo's care was a woman named Amanda Torres, a 38-year-old registered nurse who had been working in intensive care for 15 years and who was widely respected by colleagues for her exceptional clinical skills, her calm competence in crisis situations, her compassionate patient care, and her tireless advocacy for patients and families navigating the terrifying and confusing medical system. Amanda was the daughter of immigrants who had come to the country with nothing and had worked multiple minimum wage jobs to provide basic necessities for their family, and she had put herself through nursing school while working full-time as a nursing assistant and raising her own daughter as a single mother after her husband died in a construction accident when their child was only 3 years old. She knew intimately what it meant to struggle financially while trying to access health care, to make impossible choices between buying medications and paying rent, to feel powerless and invisible in a system that seemed designed to serve wealthy people while extracting maximum profit from everyone else. She had chosen nursing despite all the challenges and difficulties and emotional toll because she genuinely wanted to help people during their most vulnerable moments, and because she believed deeply that every human being, regardless of wealth or status or background, deserved compassionate, skilled care and to be treated treated with dignity and respect. When Amanda first entered Ricardo's ICU room to begin her shift caring for him, along with 2 other critically ill patients she was responsible for that evening, she had no idea who he was or that he owned the pharmaceutical company whose outrageous medication prices had bankrupted her own mother when she was dying from cancer and had forced Amanda to take out loans she was still repaying years later just to afford the treatments that ultimately only bought her mother a few extra painful months before death came anyway. All Amanda knew in that moment was that she had a patient who had suffered a devastating stroke and needed immediate expert care, and that his life and recovery depended significantly on the quality of nursing care he received during these critical first hours and days when his brain was most vulnerable and when proper interventions could mean the difference between death, permanent severe disability, or potential recovery. Ricardo was barely conscious and profoundly confused when he first became aware of Amanda's presence, his mind foggy and disoriented from the stroke and medications, his body not responding properly to his commands, one entire side of his face drooping noticeably, speech completely garbled and incomprehensible when he tried to ask questions or make demands. Amanda approached his bedside with calm, professional competence, introducing herself clearly and speaking to him in a warm but matter-of-fact tone, explaining where he was and what had happened and what the treatment plan involved, assuring him that she would be monitoring him carefully throughout the night and that he should try not to worry or stress because stress could worsen his condition, and what he needed most right now was rest and allowing his body to heal. She checked all his vital signs and equipment systematically, adjusted his position carefully to prevent pressure sores and ensure proper circulation, made sure his IV medications were flowing correctly, and documented everything meticulously in his chart, while maintaining a running gentle commentary about what she was doing so Ricardo wouldn't feel frightened or disoriented by medical procedures happening to his body. Over the following 72 hours, which were absolutely critical for Ricardo's survival and recovery, Amanda provided nursing care that went far beyond basic clinical competence and ventured into the realm of genuine artistry and compassion. She anticipated problems before they became crises, noticing subtle changes in Ricardo's condition that less experienced nurses might have missed and alerting doctors immediately so interventions could happen quickly. She managed his medications with precision, his pain and discomfort with creativity and persistence, his fear and confusion with patience and reassurance. She turned him regularly to prevent complications from immobility, kept his mouth and skin clean and comfortable, advocated firmly with doctors when she believed treatment orders needed adjustment based on what she observed at the bedside, and somehow found time, despite her overwhelming workload, to actually talk with Ricardo as a person rather than just performing tasks on his body, sharing bits of information about the world outside his ICU room, and treating him with dignity even when he was at his most vulnerable and dependent. Ricardo's adult children flew in from different cities where they had been pursuing their own successful careers, financed by their father's wealth, and they were understandably distraught and frightened, seeing their powerful father reduced to this fragile, confused state, unable to speak coherently or move half his body or control even basic functions. Amanda took time she really didn't have given her other patient care responsibilities to speak with Ricardo's children, explaining his condition in clear, understandable terms without medical jargon, helping them understand what recovery process might look like and what realistic expectations should be, preparing them for the reality that their father would likely face a long, difficult rehabilitation journey and might never fully recover his previous level of function. She was honest, but also kind, never sugarcoating the seriousness of the situation, but also offering hope grounded in her extensive experience with stroke patients who had defied predictions and worked incredibly hard to regain lost capabilities. As Ricardo began to emerge from the initial crisis period and became more alert and aware, though still severely impaired in his ability to speak and move, He started to actually observe and register Amanda as a person rather than just as a nurse performing tasks. He noticed things about her that gradually penetrated his self-absorbed consciousness that had never before paid attention to service workers or support staff as human beings worthy of interest or consideration. He noticed that she looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes suggesting she worked too many hours and probably didn't sleep enough. He noticed that her scrubs were faded and worn, though clean, suggesting she couldn't afford to regularly replace work clothes the way Ricardo bought new expensive suits without ever checking prices. He noticed that she brought food from home in an old plastic container rather than buying meals in the hospital cafeteria, suggesting she was careful with money in ways Ricardo hadn't thought about in decades. He noticed most significantly that despite her obvious exhaustion and the overwhelming demands of caring for multiple critically ill patients simultaneously, Amanda approached each interaction with him with patience and kindness, never making him feel burdensome or disgusting even when she was cleaning him after he had soiled himself or helping him with other humiliating necessities of a body that no longer functioned reliably. One evening, about a week after his stroke, when Ricardo was alert enough to attempt conversation despite his severely compromised speech, he struggled to form words asking Amanda a question that had been bothering him as he watched her work with such dedication and skill. He wanted to know why she chose to do such difficult, demanding work for what he assumed must be inadequate compensation, given that he knew hospitals' notoriously underpaid nursing staff, while executives made enormous salaries. Amanda smiled gently at his question and responded thoughtfully while checking his blood pressure and adjusting his IV pump. She told him that she became a nurse because she wanted to help people during the most frightening and vulnerable times of their lives, that she found meaning and purpose in being able to ease suffering and provide comfort and expertise when people needed it most desperately, that the work was indeed exhausting and often emotionally devastating and certainly underpaid, but that she couldn't imagine doing anything else because this was what she was meant to do with her life and talents. Ricardo found himself genuinely moved by her answer in a way he couldn't remember being moved by anything in years. His emotions closer to the surface than usual, perhaps because of the stroke's effects on his brain, or perhaps simply because facing mortality and complete helplessness had cracked open emotional armor he had been building for decades. He tried to express something about his gratitude and recognition that she was extraordinary, but the words came out garbled and unclear, and he felt frustrated tears gathering in his eyes, which horrified him because Ricardo Mendez did not cry, and certainly didn't want anyone seeing him in such a weak emotional state. Amanda seemed to understand what he was trying to communicate despite his inability to form clear words, and she gently touched his hand and told him that she knew he was frustrated with his communication difficulties, but that it was okay to feel emotional and to cry if he needed to, because surviving a stroke was traumatic and overwhelming, and no one expected him to be stoic or tough all the time. That part of healing meant allowing yourself to feel and express difficult emotions rather than constantly fighting to maintain control and strength. During one of Amanda's night shifts, when the ICU was quiet, and she had a rare moment to sit by Ricardo's bedside rather than rushing between multiple patients, Ricardo managed, through great effort, to ask her in his halting, stroke-affected speech whether she had family and what her life was like outside the hospital. Amanda hesitated briefly, wondering if sharing personal information was appropriate, but something about the genuine interest in Ricardo's eyes and the intimacy created by caring for someone through their most vulnerable moments made her decide to answer honestly. She told him about her daughter Melissa, who was now 18 and had just graduated high school with honors and been accepted to several excellent universities, but was planning to attend the local state school rather than more prestigious options because they couldn't afford the tuition at private institutions, and because Melissa wanted to stay close to home to help Amanda financially by working part-time while attending school rather than leaving her mother alone struggling with expenses. Amanda shared that her daughter wanted to become a doctor, specifically focused on serving underserved communities who lacked access to quality health care, inspired by watching her mother's commitment to nursing and by their own family experiences navigating the healthcare system without adequate resources or support. She mentioned with obvious pride mixed with sadness, that Melissa was brilliant and hardworking, and had overcome significant obstacles, including losing her father at age 3 and growing up with very limited financial resources, but never complaining or feeling sorry for herself, instead becoming determined to use education to create a better future and to help other people facing similar challenges. Ricardo listened with unaccustomed attention, and something uncomfortable began stirring in his consciousness as he connected dots he had never previously considered about how his company's pricing strategies and business practices affected real families like Amanda's, how the abstract profit margins and shareholder value he had spent decades maximizing translated into concrete human suffering for people who were just trying to survive and care for their loved ones. The turning point that would eventually change everything came during Ricardo's second week in the ICU, when he was stable enough to be visited by members of his executive team who wanted to brief him on urgent business matters that supposedly required his input despite his doctor's instructions that he needed complete rest without work stress. The visit was brief because Ricardo could neither speak clearly enough to provide guidance nor concentrate effectively for more than a few minutes at a time. But during their conversation, the executives mentioned casually that they were dealing with protests outside the company headquarters, organized by patient advocacy groups angry about recent price increases on several critical medications, including insulin and heart medications that low-income patients depended on for survival. The executives laughed dismissively about the protesters, calling them financially illiterate and economically naive, explaining to Ricardo that they had already crafted a public relations response emphasizing market forces and development costs while completely disregarding the moral concerns about pricing life-saving medications beyond what poor people could afford. Ricardo had always agreed with exactly these kinds of responses and had personally approved similar price increases dozens of times over the years without any moral qualms. But hearing his executives laugh about desperate sick people protesting for affordable medications, while he himself lay helpless in a hospital bed, completely dependent on the kindness and skill of an underpaid nurse whose own family had been bankrupted by his company's pricing strategies, suddenly made him feel profoundly sick in a way that had nothing to do with his stroke. After his executives left, Ricardo lay in his bed, unable to speak clearly, but thinking more clearly than he had in decades. Finally seeing with devastating clarity the human cost of the business empire he had built, recognizing that his wealth was directly extracted from the suffering of people like Amanda and her mother and millions of others who had no choice but to pay whatever prices were demanded for medications they needed to survive or watch their loved ones die. He thought about his own terror and helplessness over the past 2 weeks, about how frightening it was to have your body betray you and to lose control of basic functions and to depend entirely on others for survival, and he tried to imagine facing that experience without access to excellent medical care or with the additional crushing burden of medical bills that would bankrupt your family and destroy any financial security you had managed to build through years of hard work. That evening, when Amanda came on shift, Ricardo made a tremendous effort to communicate something important to her, despite his severe speech impairment. He struggled for several minutes forming words until Amanda gently suggested he try writing, if that was easier, providing him with paper and pen and supporting his functioning hand since his dominant hand was paralyzed. With enormous effort and messy handwriting that barely looked like his usual precise script, Ricardo managed to write a question that revealed how much his thinking had shifted during his weeks in the ICU depending on Amanda's care. He wrote asking whether her mother had died from cancer and whether the medication costs had been a financial burden, because something in the way she had mentioned her mother previously made him suspect there was a painful story connected to healthcare expenses. Amanda looked at the paper for a long moment before responding, and Ricardo could see her deciding whether to answer honestly or give a polite deflection to avoid emotional complexity with a patient. Finally, Amanda sat down in the chair next to Ricardo's bed and told him the truth, explaining that her mother had been diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer 5 years ago despite never having smoked, that the recommended treatment regimen included a new targeted therapy medication that cost over $10,000 per month, and that her mother's insurance would only partially cover because the insurance company categorized it as experimental despite FDA approval. Amanda described the impossible math of trying to afford that medication while also covering her mother's other medical expenses and regular living expenses, the desperate choices about which bills to pay and which to let go delinquent, the decision to take out high-interest loans that Amanda was still repaying years later, the guilt her mother felt about financially destroying her daughter's stability in exchange for a few extra months of painful life. She mentioned without initially realizing the significance that one of the medications that had been particularly devastating financially was manufactured by Ricardo's company, which had raised the price by over 400% in 3 years because they had acquired the patent and eliminated generic competition through legal strategies specifically designed to maintain monopoly pricing power. Ricardo felt like he had been physically struck when he realized that his company had directly profited from Amanda's mother's suffering and death, that Amanda had spent the past 2 weeks providing extraordinary, compassionate care to the man whose business decisions had bankrupted her family and perhaps hastened her mother's death by making necessary treatments unaffordable. The expression on his face must have conveyed something of his shock and guilt, because Amanda quickly reassured him that she wasn't telling him this to make him feel bad or to blame him personally, that she was just answering his question honestly, and that she understood he probably had nothing to do with specific pricing decisions at his company. But Ricardo knew better than Amanda did just how directly responsible he was for every major pricing strategy his company had implemented, how many times he had personally approved unconscionable price increases for essential medications, while dismissing concerns from ethical board members who were subsequently pushed out when they wouldn't support profit maximization above all other considerations. Ricardo wrote another note with his shaking hand, asking Amanda how she could possibly provide such kind care to him, knowing what his company had done to her family, how she didn't hate him, or at minimum feel resentment that would make her want to provide only minimal adequate care rather than the exceptional treatment she had been giving him. Amanda read his note and thought carefully before responding, telling him that she had made a conscious decision years ago that she would never allow anyone else's bad behavior or cruel policies to turn her into a person who was cruel or uncaring in return, that she refused to become bitter or to let anger and resentment poison her own character and her ability to help people who needed her skills. She explained that she had learned from her mother, who had remained gracious and kind even while dying in poverty caused by medical expenses, who had told Amanda explicitly that holding on to anger and hatred would hurt Amanda far more than it would hurt the people or companies responsible for their suffering, that the only way to honor her mother's memory and her own values was to keep doing good work and treating everyone with compassion, regardless of whether they deserved it or had treated others with similar care. Ricardo was absolutely humbled by Amanda's response, recognizing that she possessed a moral strength and character depth that he had spent decades actively degrading in himself through his ruthless business practices and his choice to view all human interactions through the lens of profit and personal advantage. He wrote one more note that night, his handwriting even messier because his hand was trembling from emotion rather than just physical impairment, telling Amanda that she was a better person than he could ever hope to be, and that he was profoundly grateful for her care, but also profoundly ashamed about the business he had built and the suffering it had caused to people exactly like her and her mother. Amanda read the note and then surprised Ricardo by reaching out and taking his functioning hand in both of hers, telling him gently that shame was a useful emotion only if it led to genuine change rather than just self-indulgent guilt, that if he really understood the harm his company had caused, then he had the power and responsibility to do something about it, rather than just feeling bad, that his stroke had given him a second chance at life, and he needed to decide what he was going to do with that chance and what legacy he wanted to leave beyond just accumulated wealth built on other people's suffering. The weeks and months that followed Ricardo's stroke were some of the most difficult and challenging of his entire life, as he faced the brutal work of physical and speech rehabilitation, while simultaneously confronting the moral implications of his business practices and trying to determine how to make meaningful amends without simply engaging in performative charity that would salve his conscience without addressing systemic problems. Amanda continued caring for Ricardo throughout his ICU stay and periodically checked on him even after he transferred to the rehabilitation unit, maintaining their unusual friendship that had formed through the intimacy of serious illness and honest emotional conversation. Ricardo's adult children were confused and concerned by changes they saw in their father's attitudes and priorities, as he began questioning business decisions and expressing concerns about corporate ethics and medication pricing that they had never heard from him before, and that seemed completely unlike the hard-driving, profit-focused father they had always known. When Ricardo was finally well enough to participate in video conference meetings from his rehabilitation facility, he shocked his executive team and board of directors by announcing that he wanted to fundamentally restructure the company's pricing strategies and business model to prioritize affordable access to essential medications over maximum profit extraction, that he had been wrong about many things over the years and wanted to use whatever remaining time and influence he had to make the company something he could actually be proud of, rather than just something that made him wealthy. The board members and executives responded with predictable resistance and alarm, warning that such changes would reduce shareholder value and might open the company to hostile takeover attempts from competitors who would simply reverse any ethical reforms and return to pure profit maximization. Some board members quietly suggested that Ricardo's stroke had affected his judgment and cognitive abilities, and that perhaps it was time for him to step down from leadership and let people with clearer thinking run the company according to proven successful strategies. Ricardo had expected this resistance and had prepared with help from Amanda and several trusted allies, including his own grown children, who had been surprisingly supportive once he explained his thinking and his moral awakening. He announced that he was using his controlling ownership stake to restructure the board of directors, removing members who refused to support ethical business practices and adding new directors, including patient advocates, ethicists, and people with public health backgrounds who could provide expertise and perspective beyond just financial optimization. He initiated a comprehensive review of medication pricing with instructions that no essential medication should be priced above what middle-income families could afford without severe financial hardship, even if that meant accepting lower profit margins and potentially facing pressure from shareholders who cared only about returns on investment regardless of human costs. He established a foundation funded with a significant portion of his personal wealth, specifically focused on helping families afford medications and medical care, and he asked Amanda to serve on the foundation board to ensure that decisions were informed by real patient experiences rather than theoretical abstractions. These changes were controversial and difficult, creating tension within the company and attracting criticism both from business associates who thought Ricardo had lost his mind and abandoned sound business principles, and from some patient advocacy groups who were skeptical about whether these changes were genuine reforms or just public relations manipulation following bad publicity from protests about pricing. Ricardo accepted the criticism and skepticism as deserved given his company's history, and he focused on implementing concrete systemic changes rather than just making promises or announcements, understanding that trust would have to be earned through sustained action over time rather than through words or grand gestures. Amanda helped keep him grounded during this difficult transition by reminding him regularly that his motivation needed to stay focused on actually helping people rather than on rehabilitating his own image or feeling like a good person, that the work of making amends for harm caused was ongoing and could never really be completed, but had to be pursued persistently anyway because it was the right thing to do, regardless of whether it made him feel better or earned him recognition. The transformation wasn't just professional, but deeply personal as well, with Ricardo fundamentally reconsidering his values and priorities and relationships throughout his life. He began spending significantly more time with his adult children actually talking about meaningful topics rather than just discussing business or giving advice about career advancement, learning who they really were as people beyond their professional accomplishments and beginning to build authentic emotional connections that had been superficial and distant throughout their lives. lives. He reached out to family members and old friends he had discarded or neglected over the years as he climbed professionally and socially, apologizing for his previous coldness and self-absorption and asking whether relationships might be rebuilt if he genuinely changed his behavior going forward. He made significant financial donations to causes that Amanda cared about, including her daughter Melissa's college education, which he insisted on funding completely, including paying back loans Amanda had already taken out, as well as supporting nursing scholarships and programs that provided health care to underserved communities. The romantic dimension of the story developed gradually over the year following Ricardo's stroke as his rehabilitation progressed, and his friendship with Amanda deepened into something neither had initially expected or planned. They were unlikely partners from completely different worlds with different backgrounds and values and life experiences, but their connection, forged in the crucible of serious illness and moral reckoning, proved surprisingly durable and meaningful. Amanda was initially very hesitant about allowing the relationship to become romantic, worried about power dynamics given that Ricardo had been her patient and remained extraordinarily wealthy while she continued working as a nurse with relatively modest income, concerned about how his family and her colleagues might perceive the relationship, and uncertain whether Ricardo's apparent transformation was genuine and lasting or might prove to be temporary emotional reaction to his health crisis that would fade once he fully recovered. Ricardo understood and respected Amanda's concerns completely, and he never pushed or pressured, but instead demonstrated through consistent behavior over many months that his changes were real and permanent, that he valued her as an equal partner despite differences in wealth and social status, that he had learned from her example what it meant to live with integrity and compassion rather than constantly calculating advantage and positioning. When he eventually asked Amanda to marry him after 18 months of increasingly serious dating, he did so thoughtfully and humbly, acknowledging his past failures and his ongoing journey of moral growth, asking not whether she would marry someone perfect who had always lived well, but whether she would be willing to build a life with someone profoundly flawed who was genuinely committed to becoming a better person and using whatever privilege and resources he had to help rather than exploit others. Amanda said yes to Ricardo's proposal after careful consideration and conversations with her daughter Melissa, whose blessing and support were essential before Amanda would consider remarrying. Melissa had been understandably wary at first when she learned her mother was dating the man who owned the company that had profited from her grandmother's medical expenses, but she had been gradually won over by Ricardo's genuine humility and his concrete actions backing up his stated values. By seeing how happy he made her mother and how he treated Amanda with respect and partnership rather than condescension or patronizing charity. The wedding was a modest affair by billionaire standards, reflecting Ricardo's transformed values and Amanda's practical nature, focusing on genuine celebration with close friends and family rather than ostentatious display of wealth designed to impress people who didn't matter. Today, 5 years after that July afternoon when Ricardo collapsed and his life was saved by paramedics, followed by Amanda's skilled nursing care and moral example, Ricardo and Amanda are married and working together on social justice and healthcare access initiatives through the foundation they jointly lead. Ricardo has recovered much of his speech and mobility, though he still walks with a slight limp and occasionally struggles to find words, accepting his physical limitations with patience and even gratitude, because his stroke forced a reckoning that probably saved him from wasting whatever years he had left in empty pursuit of more wealth and status. His pharmaceutical company has survived and even prospered despite implementing ethical pricing policies that prioritize patient access over maximum profit, proving that business success doesn't require exploiting vulnerable people and that there's actually competitive advantage to being known as a company people trust and respect rather than fear and resent. Amanda continues working as an ICU nurse part-time despite no longer needing income for financial survival, choosing to maintain her clinical skills and direct patient care because that work grounds her values and keeps her connected to the realities that wealthy philanthropists can easily lose sight of when they're spending their days in comfortable offices, making decisions about other people's lives. Her daughter, Melissa, is now in medical school and planning to specialize in oncology, with focus on serving underserved communities, carrying forward her grandmother's legacy by choosing service over financial optimization. The relationship between Ricardo and Amanda continues to be strong and meaningful, built on mutual respect and shared values and deep appreciation for the ways each has helped the other become better and more complete as human beings. The deeper truth of this story goes far beyond personal transformation or second chances, though those themes are certainly central and important. The real lesson is about the power of authentic human connection to crack open even the most hardened hearts and make visible the suffering and humanity we've been trained by systems of inequality to ignore or rationalize. It teaches us that we're all vulnerable and dependent on others, especially during illness and crisis, that the divisions of class and wealth and status that seem so solid and meaningful in ordinary life can disappear instantly when you're helpless in a hospital bed, relying on the skill and compassion of people you might previously have looked down upon or dismissed as less important than yourself. It shows us that moral transformation is possible at any age, but requires both crisis that forces us to see what we've been avoiding and the presence of someone willing to model and expect better from us, even when we've given them every reason to write us off as irredeemable. This story reminds us that the people providing essential care in our society, whether nurses or teachers or service workers or any other roles that are chronically undervalued and underpaid, deserve not just our gratitude, but our active support and advocacy for just compensation and working conditions, that we cannot be moral people while benefiting from systems that exploit and extract value from people doing work that's essential but invisible to those who aren't paying attention. It challenges us to examine how our own comfort and privilege might be built on other people's suffering through chains of cause and effect that are deliberately obscured by corporations and institutions that profit from our ignorance and apathy. Most fundamentally, it teaches that authentic change comes not from feeling guilty about privilege and harm we've caused, but from taking concrete, sustained action to address inequalities and to use whatever resources and influence we have to support justice rather than maintaining systems that benefit us at others' expense. If this story moved you and made you think differently about healthcare workers, or about the human costs of profit-maximizing business practices, or about your own potential complicity in systems of injustice, please leave a like on this video, so I know this kind of challenging content resonates with you. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss future stories about moral transformation and redemption, about seeing the humanity in people we've been taught to overlook or devalue, about having the courage to acknowledge when we've been wrong and to change direction even when that's uncomfortable and costly. And please share in the comments your own experiences with healthcare workers who made profound impacts on your life, or times when crisis forced you to reconsider your values and priorities, or ways you're working to build more just and compassionate systems in your own sphere of influence, because your stories and commitments inspire all of us to do better and be better in our own lives and communities.